So this video is for students in the course Biography in its many forms. Good to see everybody. Mr. Zito here to tell you a little bit about the revision process for your close reading essays on Ernest Hemingway's A Moveable Feast. So my first point about the close reading paper is that the passages that you choose, they need to have some depth to them. So at this point, you likely have several quotations, and I use those terms, quotations and passages, interchangeably, so don't be confused. And as you go back through your paper and revise, you need to think about exactly what you have to say about your chosen passages. And if your analysis, which should directly follow each quotation, merely restates what Ernest Hemingway, the author, has indicated, perhaps in slightly different language, or perhaps you define certain words, that might not be enough for a close reading. A good close reading analyzes language and makes meaning on a deeper level that might not be possible upon an initial reading of the text. But after you spend some time with the text and study language a bit more carefully, other meanings tend to emerge. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. And this will sound familiar because we looked at this example in class a week ago. In chapter 17, which is titled F. Scott Fitzgerald, the longest chapter in A Moveable Feast, Ernest Hemingway ends up going down to Lyon solo because his new friend Scott missed the train that they had agreed to take together. And you'll recall that Ernest is really frustrated and actually flabbergasted that Scott would miss the train and not send word to Ernest in advance. And not really knowing what to do, Ernest takes the train because that's the most logical course of action. He goes down to Lyon, stays in a hotel, and Scott finds him at that hotel the next morning. And when they have this conversation in the lobby of the hotel, Scott says something to the effect of, well, the train I took, it was rather comfortable, and we very easily could have just come down together. On the surface, what he seems to be saying there is it would have been nice to come down together. But the deeper meaning is Scott is expressing frustration with Ernest for not waiting for him. Now, there's another meaning going on here on the level of authorship, and that is that Hemingway has aligned us with himself as a young man, and we are most sympathetic to Ernest because he's our narrator and the protagonist of this true story. And we understand that he is very frustrated with Scott because Scott was supposed to catch the train and didn't, and put Ernest in a difficult situation. And now Scott seems to be blaming Ernest for the mix-up. So if I were writing an essay and looking at that particular line, I might interpret that as evidence of a certain characteristic that Hemingway, the author, is pointing out in Scott, and as a real character flaw. And there's a certain lack of consideration at play here, that Scott cannot see beyond himself. He's so self-centered, egotistical, that from his point of view, the mix-up has to be Ernest's fault, and that it doesn't make sense to him that Ernest would have gotten on the train that he got on without Scott, when in fact, from an objective point of view, clearly Scott is the one to blame because he missed the train in the first place and didn't communicate with Ernest. So that, again, might be part of a larger essay about friendship and about the qualities of a good friend that Hemingway, as an author, is pointing out. Now, we also know from reading that entire chapter that by the end of the chapter, Ernest is committed to being Scott's friend because he recognizes the genius of Scott's writing and also comes to know the personal problems that Scott has, especially in his marriage. And Ernest wants to be a support to Scott. So there is more going on there, but that's just one example of a close reading, of a bit of dialogue. And you can do close reading with narration, you can do it with dialogue. One example in narration might be when Scott and Ernest are riding together back to Paris from Lyon. Hemingway, as the author, narrates that they had picked up 4 more bottles of wine, which they uncorked as they needed them. And the literal line there is, as we needed them. And so again, on the surface, it might seem like what he's saying is, when we finished one bottle, we opened another. But a deeper meaning is his use of the word needed, which suggests a kind of dependency, an inability to be together and make it through this trip together without drinking wine, which suggests alcoholism that Ernest was becoming aware of in Scott, and that we can't help but notice Hemingway, the author, pointing out in himself. So some examples there of close reading of passages. A few other things to keep in mind as you are revising this paper. Your tone needs to be rather formal. Of course, you want your voice to come through, but this is a formal academic essay, and so keep in mind that you should follow all of the standard conventions of academic writing. The other pieces that you've written for this course so far have been creative nonfiction, and so you've been able to use contractions in the first person and informal expressions, what I call colloquialisms, and that's great in creative writing. But in a literary essay that's academic in nature, which a close reading is, you should not use contractions. So words like don't, couldn't, should've, etc. And you should generally avoid use of the first person pronouns, I, me, my, unless you're asserting your own views in comparison to other scholars, which you're really not doing in this essay. So I don't see a need for first person. First person plural might be okay, we, our, if you're referring collectively to the reader. But try to avoid phrases like in my opinion or I believe. Additionally, for this paper, you want to use present tense whenever you are recounting the action of the story. So, for example, Scott meets up with Ernest at the hotel. Ernest finds Scott waiting for him in the hotel lobby. Both of the verbs in those sentences are in the present tense. Even though this is a work of nonfiction and presumably these events actually happened, when you're explaining what happens in the story, the convention is use the present tense. Try to avoid comparing what happens in a movable feast to events in your own life or in the world today or in the time since the 1920s. Limit the scope of this discussion to what Ernest Hemingway as an author presents to us in his memoir. Your job in writing a literary essay, a close reading in this case, is to try to interpret meaning from the author. What is an important idea that Hemingway, as an author, writing tragically toward the end of his life, he was in his late 50s, in the late 1950s, what is it that he is emphasizing? Either a lesson that he has learned, a value, an idea that clearly is important to him, and that collectively your chosen passages and close reading analysis support. So that's really the goal, and by the time you arrive at the end of your essay, it should be clear to the reader what that idea is that you are interpreting from Ernest Hemingway. So those are my thoughts for now. Look forward to seeing everyone on Zoom on Thursday. Hopefully there won't be too many glitches there. We'll do the best that we can and fix any problems going forward. Feel free to reach out to me via email, or you could even call me on my cell phone if you're feeling bold. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and the next video will be about Bob Dylan's Chronicles. Looking forward to getting into discussions with you about that, and see you then. Bye.